Frank Miller was a man who built things to last. He built a house with his own two hands, a marriage of 54 years, and a family he thought was as solid as the oak beams in his living room ceiling. He was 78 years old, lying in a hospital bed, and he was listening to his legacy being dismantled. His children, Michael and Susan, thought he was unconscious, lost in the silent country between a stroke and whatever came next. They stood by his bed, their whispers sharp and clear as breaking glass, and they fought over the money. Not his life, the money. Frank heard every single word, and in the sterile, beeping quiet of that room, he woke up, not just from the stroke, but from a lifetime of illusion. He and his wife, Dorothy, would leave that hospital and walk away from everything they had built. They would buy an abandoned county jail for less than the price of a used television, a place of rust and ruin. And there, in the most unlikely of structures, they would build something new, something that would last. They would take in the broken and the lost, creating a fortress of community against a world that discarded people like broken tools. And when the county came to condemn it, and when their own children came to claim them, they would find that Frank and Dorothy were no longer victims. They were founders. This is the story of how they did it. But to understand the end, you have to go back to the beginning. The beginning was a house, not just a structure of wood and nails, but a living record of a life. Frank built it in 1968 on a plot of land he and Dorothy bought with every penny they had saved. He was a carpenter, a master of his trade, and he poured all his skill and love into its foundation, its walls, its roof. Every joint was perfect. Every board was true. He could walk through it blindfolded and tell you the story of each room by the feel of the floor beneath his feet. This was the spot where Michael took his first steps. This was the scratch on the doorframe where Susan measured her height year after year. This was the kitchen where Dorothy had cooked thousands of meals, her presence a warm, steady hum in the heart of the home. Dorothy was the observer, the planner. Where Frank was hands, she was mind. A retired bookkeeper and substitute teacher, her world was one of numbers and letters, of order and quiet strategy. She managed their finances with a meticulousness that had seen them through lean years and prosperous ones. She had raised their children with a gentle but firm hand, believing she had instilled in them the same values of hard work and decency that she and Frank lived by. She saw the world in ledgers and lesson plans, in cause and effect. She believed that if you did right by people, they would do right by you, especially your own blood. Their life was a quiet tapestry woven from simple threads. Morning coffee on the porch Frank had screened in himself. Evenings spent reading in the armchairs they'd had for 30 years. Grandchildren's birthday parties in the backyard, the scent of cut grass and charcoal, smoke filling the air. It was a modest life, but it was earned. It was theirs. They had never asked for much, and they had provided everything for their children. College educations, down payments on first homes, an endless supply of love and support. They had assumed, in the quiet, unspoken way that parents do, that this foundation of love would be their safety net in their old age. Michael was their son, a man who had inherited Frank's ambition but none of his patience. He was in real estate, a world of quick flips and leveraged assets. He saw his father's house not as a home, but as a property, a tear down on a valuable lot. He visited on holidays, his eyes always scanning the acreage, his mind calculating square footage and market value. His conversations were peppered with talk of development and zoning changes. Frank and Dorothy heard the words, but chose not to understand the meaning behind them. Susan was their daughter, a woman adrift in a sea of perceived injustices. She felt the world owed her a certain lifestyle, one her job as a gallery assistant could not provide. She loved the beautiful things in her parents' home, the antique furniture Dorothy had inherited, the hand-carved chests Frank had made. She loved them not for their history, but for their price tags. Her affection was a form of appraisal. She would run her hand over a cherrywood dresser, and her compliments would sound like an auctioneer's opening bid. The first tremor came on a Tuesday in October. Frank was in the yard, raking the last of the autumn leaves, when a sudden, blinding headache sent him to his knees. The world tilted, the brilliant colors of the maples smearing into a gray blur. He felt a strange numbness creep up his left side, and then nothing. Dorothy found him minutes later, a still figure in a sea of red and gold leaves. The hospital was a world of harsh lights and muted, anxious voices. Dorothy sat by his bedside, holding his calloused, unresponsive hand. The doctor, a young man with tired eyes, used words like ischemic stroke and prognosis uncertain. He spoke of recovery as a possibility, not a promise. For 2 days, Frank lay motionless. His breathing was steady, a rhythmic puffing sound from the machine beside him, but his eyes remained closed. He was there, but he was gone. Michael and Susan arrived on the second day. They brought flowers that smelled faintly of the refrigerated truck they came from. They embraced their mother, their hugs brief and stiff. They looked at their father, their faces arranged in masks of sorrow. Dorothy, consumed by her own fear, was grateful for their presence. She saw them as pillars, not knowing they were already calculating the demolition. She stepped out of the room to get a cup of coffee, her own exhaustion a heavy cloak on her shoulders. The hallway was long and sterile. The coffee from the machine was bitter and weak. She was gone for perhaps 10 minutes. It was long enough. When she walked back toward the room, she heard their voices. They were not the hushed, worried whispers of grieving children. They were sharp, cutting. "We have to sell the house, Susan." Michael's voice was insistent, stripped of all pretense. "I have a buyer, a developer. They'll pay cash, close in 30 days. We can't afford to sit on it. And what about Mom?" Susan's voice was high, laced with a familiar whine. "She can't live there alone. We'll have to find a place for her. A good one, obviously, but they're expensive." "The sale will cover it," Michael said dismissively. "It'll cover everything and leave a healthy chunk for both of us. Dad's portfolio is solid, but this property is the real prize. We have to act fast before the market cools." "And the furniture?" Susan pressed. "That bureau in the master bedroom is a Stickley. It's worth at least $10,000. And Grandma's silver. I'm not letting you just roll that into some quick sale." "We'll sort it out," Michael said, his voice tight with irritation. "The priority is the cash from the house. We can get an appraiser for the junk inside later." "Junk?" The word hit Dorothy like a physical blow. She stood frozen in the hallway, the styrofoam cup trembling in her hand. The life she and Frank had built, the things they had cherished, the home that held every memory they had ever made. It was all just junk and assets to be liquidated. And her, she was a liability to be managed, a cost to be covered. Inside the room, Frank was swimming up from a deep, dark place. Sound came first, distorted and distant, like voices heard from underwater. He fought toward them, toward the familiar cadence of his children's speech. The words began to resolve, sharpening into daggers. He heard sell the house, he heard a place for her, he heard cash, he heard junk. His mind, foggy and slow, latched onto the cold, hard clarity of their greed. There was no grief in their voices, no love, only calculation. A lifetime of fatherhood, of sacrifice, of believing he had raised good people, dissolved in that single, horrifying moment. The stroke had paralyzed his body, but their words paralyzed his soul. With an effort that felt monumental, an act of pure, desperate will, he forced his eyelids to open. They fluttered, then opened. The light was painfully bright. He saw the cracked ceiling tile directly above him. He saw the force stand, and then he turned his head, a slow, creaking movement, and looked at his children. They were standing over his bed, leaning in, their faces inches from each other in conspiratorial closeness. They didn't see him at first. They were too engrossed in their vulture's dance. "I'm telling you, Michael, I get first pick of the antiques," Susan was saying. Frank blinked. The small movement was enough. Michael's head snapped toward him. His eyes widened. The color drained from his face. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice a strangled croak. Susan followed his gaze. A small gasp escaped her lips. She took a half step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Silence. A profound, bottomless silence filled the room. broken only by the steady, indifferent beep of the heart monitor. In that silence, Frank's gaze held theirs. He said nothing. He did not have to. They knew. They knew he had heard. Their shame and their greed were naked in the sterile hospital light. Dorothy pushed the door open and stepped inside. She saw the scene. Her husband, awake and staring. Her children, pale and horrified. She looked from their faces to Frank's, and she understood immediately. The betrayal was complete. It was absolute. The drive home from the hospital a week later was the quietest trip of their 54-year marriage. Frank's recovery had been, in the doctor's words, miraculous. His speech was slightly slurred, his left side weak, but he was walking. He was thinking. He was remembering. He sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the passing scenery, but seeing only the faces of his children in that hospital room. Dorothy drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. They hadn't spoken of it. Not directly. Frank had simply told her, his voice rough but firm, "I heard them. I heard it all." And she had replied, "I know. I did too." There was nothing more to say. The wound was too deep for words. When they pulled into their driveway, the house looked different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a property, a collection of assets. They walked through the front door, and the familiar comfort was gone, replaced by a cold, alien feeling. Every object seemed to cry out its value. The Stickley bureau, the silver tea set, the hand-hooked rugs. It felt like living in a museum, or worse, a tomb. For 2 weeks, they lived as ghosts in their own home. Frank spent his days in his workshop, sanding a piece of wood over and over, the repetitive motion a way to dull the noise in his head. Dorothy moved through the house, cleaning and tidying, but her heart wasn't in it. The silence between them was not the comfortable silence of old companionship. It was a heavy, grieving silence, thick with unspoken pain. Their children called. First Michael, his voice breezy and false. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How's Dad feeling? So great he's home." Then Susan, her tone dripping with saccharine concern. "Mommy, I've been so worried. Are you sure you're managing okay?" Dorothy's responses were brief and cold. "We're fine." She did not invite them over. They did not offer to come. A new, unspoken border had been drawn. The turning point came on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks after Frank came home. He was asleep in his armchair, the television murmuring in the background. Dorothy was at the kitchen table, a stack of bills and bank statements in front of her. She was doing what she always did when faced with chaos. She was imposing order. She was calculating their assets, not as an inheritance, but as a war chest. She looked at the numbers. They were comfortable. They had their pensions, Social Security, and a healthy nest egg. Frank's careful investments had grown over the decades. They owned the house outright. They were, by any measure, secure. But the feeling of security was gone. The house was tainted. Their future, which had once seemed a gentle slope into old age, now felt like a precarious cliff edge. They were waiting for their children to come and push them over. She would not wait. Dorothy was not a victim. She was a planner. She opened her laptop, the screen a bright rectangle in the dim light. She didn't know what she was looking for. An apartment, maybe, a small cottage somewhere far away. She typed real estate and their county name into the search bar. She scrolled through listings of split-level homes and tidy condos, her mind rejecting each one. They were boxes, lifeless containers. After building a life from scratch, she couldn't bear the thought of shrinking into a prefabricated existence. On a whim, she clicked on the search filters and changed the property type to commercial and sorted the price from low to high. It was a gesture of pure, aimless curiosity. The first few listings were empty lots, condemned storefronts. And then she saw it. The listing was almost a joke. A single grainy photo of a squat, brick building with barred windows. The description was blunt: former county detention facility. Sold as is. Significant structural issues. Land value only. The price was $6,000. $6,000. It was absurd. It was less than the value of the Stickley bureau her daughter coveted. Dorothy stared at the picture. The building was ugly, grim, a relic of a forgotten time. It was a place of punishment and despair. It was perfect. A strange, Cold resolve settled over her. She clicked through the handful of photos. A long, grim hallway lined with steel doors. A tiny booking office with a peeling counter. A cell, empty except for a steel bunk bolted to the wall. It was a shell, a ruin, but it was made of brick and steel. It was built to contain, to endure. Frank built things to last. This place had lasted. She got up and walked over to Frank's armchair. She gently shook his shoulder. He startled awake, his eyes confused for a moment. "Frank," she said, her voice steady, "I need you to look at something." He followed her to the kitchen table. He squinted at the laptop screen, his expression unreadable. He looked at the photo, read the description, and then looked back at the photo. He was silent for a full minute. Dorothy waited, her heart pounding. "It's a jail," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "I know," she replied. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the steel in her eyes. He saw the plan she had not yet spoken. He saw the escape route. He saw the future. A small, slow smile spread across his face. It was the first time she had seen him smile in a month. "Well," he said, leaning closer to the screen. The foundation looked solid. The decision was made in that moment, without fanfare or lengthy discussion. It was a silent pact. They would not be discarded. They would not be managed. They would disappear. The next morning, Dorothy called the real estate agent, a man who sounded both amused and baffled by her interest. She made a cash offer for the asking price, sight unseen, contingent on a single walkthrough. The agent agreed, a note of disbelief in his voice. They drove out to the property that afternoon. It was located on the far edge of the county, down a gravel road that had long since been forgotten by the paving crews. The old jail sat on a 2-acre plot of overgrown land, surrounded by a sagging chain-link fence. It looked even more grim in person. The brick was stained with decades of weather, and the small, high windows looked like vacant eyes. The agent, a man named Bill with a cheap suit and a weary expression, unlocked the heavy steel door. It groaned open, revealing a wave of cold, musty air. The inside was a tomb of dust and shadows. Light struggled through the grimy windows, illuminating floating dust motes. The main hallway, the cell block, was lined with 8 cells, 4 on each side. The steel doors stood ajar, silent and menacing. Bill gave them a perfunctory tour. "As you can see, it needs work," he said, stating the obvious with a cynical wave of his hand. County used it until the new facility was built in '82. Been sitting empty ever since. Vandals got in a few years back, stole the copper piping. No water, no electricity. Roof leaks in the warden's office. Frank ignored him. He was running his hand along a brick wall, his fingers tracing the mortar lines. He was tapping the steel door of a cell, listening to the solid, resonant thud. He was looking up at the ceiling, his eyes seeing not the water stains but the bones of the building. He was a carpenter, and he was reading the story of the structure. Dorothy walked into one of the cells. It was tiny, no bigger than a walk-in closet. A steel slab for a bed, a toilet and sink combination in the corner. The walls were thick concrete. It was a cage, but it was also a fortress. She imagined it with the door removed, the walls painted a warm white, a small window cut into the back wall. She could see it. They finished the tour in the front office. Bill, eager to be done, handed them the paperwork. "You sure about this?" he asked, one last attempt at due diligence. Frank looked at Dorothy. She nodded once. "We're sure," Frank said. His voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. They liquidated a portion of their stock portfolio, a clean, digital transaction that felt blessedly impersonal. They hired a lawyer, a young woman who advised them to create a trust, a legal entity to own their new property and remaining assets. It was a shield, another wall. Dorothy understood shields. The paperwork was signed. The old county jail was theirs. They told no one. Michael and Susan continued their periodic, hollow phone calls. Dorothy continued to give them short, non-committal answers. They were moving pieces on a board their children didn't even know existed. The first day of work was daunting. They arrived in Frank's old pickup truck, loaded with tools, cleaning supplies, and 2 thermoses of hot coffee. The scale of the task ahead was immense. The building was not just empty. It was filled with the residue of decay. Thick layers of dust, cobwebs as intricate as lace, the skeletal remains of birds and rodents. Frank started in the warden's office, the room with the leaking roof. He climbed a ladder, his movements slow but steady, his body relearning its old rhythms. He found the source of the leak, a section of rotted plywood and torn tar paper. It was a big job, but it was a noble job. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Unlike the mess with his children, Dorothy began the Great Purge. Armed with a broom, a shovel, and a box of heavy-duty trash bags, she started in the cell block. She swept out decades of dirt and debris. She scrubbed the steel doors, removing layers of grime. The work was grueling, physical, and deeply satisfying. With every bag of trash she filled, she felt like she was clearing out a part of her own grief. She was not a bookkeeper managing a loss. She was a woman reclaiming territory. They worked from sunup to sundown. They ate sandwiches sitting on the tailgate of the truck. They spoke little, but their silence was different now. It was the comfortable, efficient silence of two people working toward a common goal. The shared purpose was a balm on their wounded spirits. Days turned into weeks. Frank repaired the roof, a patchwork of new tar and shingles that was ugly but watertight. He tore out the rusted, non-functional plumbing. He started the monumental task of running new electrical wiring, his old skills coming back to him with the feel of the tools in his hands. He was not just a retired old man with a weak left side. He was Frank the carpenter again. He was building. Their first breakthrough came during a trip to the local hardware store in the small town nearby. It was an old-fashioned place with wooden floors that creaked and a smell of sawdust and metal. The owner was a man about Frank's age, with a weathered face and hands stained with a dozen different kinds of paint and grease. His name was Earl Hobbs. Earl watched them for a while as they gathered supplies. Heavy gauge wire, junction boxes, industrial cleaning fluids. He saw the quiet determination in their faces. He saw the sawdust on Frank's boots. "Big project?" Earl finally asked, his voice a friendly rasp. "You could say that," Frank replied, a hint of a smile on his face. "We're fixing up the old jail." Earl's eyebrows shot up. "The jail? I figured they'd tear that place down years ago. What in the world are you doing with that?" "We're going to live in it," Dorothy said simply, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Earl stared at them for a long moment, his expression shifting from disbelief to a kind of grudging respect. He wasn't a man who pried. He was a man who understood projects. He saw two people with a monumental task ahead of them, and he saw a fellow craftsman in Frank. "Well, he said, shaking his head. "Tell you what, you're going to need a commercial-grade breaker panel for a place that size. I've got one in the back, been sitting there for 5 years. A customer ordered it and never picked it up. You can have it for what I paid for it." It was a small gesture, but it was the first act of kindness they had received from a stranger in a very long time. It was not charity. It was a professional courtesy. It was a sign of welcome. It was Earl Hobbs seeing them not as two confused old people, but as builders, as peers. That was the beginning of their first alliance. Earl became their supplier, their consultant, and their quiet supporter. He let them run a tab. He special-ordered materials for them. He never asked why they were living in a jail. He just asked if they had the right gauge of wire for the job. With Earl's help, their progress accelerated. One evening, after weeks of painstaking work, Frank flipped a switch on a new breaker panel. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling in the main hallway flickered, then blazed to life. It cast long, sharp shadows down the cell block, but it was light. It was a victory. Frank and Dorothy stood there in the middle of the hallway, bathed in the harsh, beautiful light. For the first time in months, Dorothy heard her husband laugh. It was a rusty and used sound, but it was real. They had light. They had a foothold. The next phase of the project was to make the space livable. Frank, with a grim satisfaction, took a cutting torch to the steel bars on the windows. He then used a diamond-bladed saw to cut away the steel cell doors, leaving open doorways. The grim, oppressive cages began to look like small monastic rooms. They decided to combine two cells on one side to make a master bedroom. Frank took down the concrete block wall between them with a sledgehammer, the rhythmic, percussive blows echoing through the building. It was hard, punishing work, but with every swing he felt stronger. He was literally breaking down prison walls. Dorothy, meanwhile, was the master of logistics. She found a salvage yard that sold used kitchen cabinets and appliances. She bought a mismatched but functional set for a few $100s. She found a company that sold reclaimed flooring. She spent hours on her laptop, hunting for bargains, stretching their budget with the same precision she had once used on their household accounts. They worked through the winter. The unheated building was brutally cold. They wore layers of clothing and warmed their hands over a small propane heater. They installed a wood-burning stove in the central hallway, its warmth a welcome comfort. The stove became the heart of their new home, a place to gather at the end of a long day, sipping tea and planning the next day's work. They were utterly isolated and utterly content. They had a purpose. They were a team. The pain of their children's betrayal had not vanished, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a paralyzing grief. It was fuel. It was the fire in the wood stove that kept them warm. As spring approached, their strange new home began to take shape. The cell block was now a long, central living area with small rooms branching off it. They had a functioning kitchen, a bathroom with a shower Frank had plumbed himself, and a cozy bedroom. The concrete floors were covered with warm wood. The gray walls were painted a soft, creamy white. Light, once a scarce commodity, now poured in through the unbarred windows. One afternoon, as Dorothy was planting a small vegetable garden in the rocky soil out front, a battered car pulled up to their fence. A young woman got out. She looked no older than 20, with a pale, frightened face and a belly swollen with pregnancy. She clutched a worn-out backpack to her chest. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I heard someone in town said that you were fixing this place up, that you might have work." Dorothy looked at the girl. She saw the desperation in her eyes, the faint bruise on her cheek. She saw a story of pain and flight. She saw a fellow refugee. "What's your name?" Dorothy asked, her voice gentle. "Sarah," the girl replied. "Well, Sarah," Dorothy said, leaning on her trowel, "we don't have any money to pay you, but we have a lot of work, and we have an extra room, and I always cook too much for supper." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. That evening, for the first time, there were 3 people at the dinner table in the old jail. Sarah told them her story in fits and starts. A boyfriend with a heavy hand, a family that had turned its back on her. She had been living in her car for a week. Sarah stayed. She was a tireless worker, eager to earn her keep. She painted walls. She helped Dorothy in the garden. She learned to spackle in sand. Her presence changed the dynamic of the place. The quiet solitude of 2 was replaced by the gentle hum of 3. Her youthful energy was a welcome addition. She was the first citizen of their new, unintentional community. A month later, another stray arrived. This time, it was an older man, Walter, a retired plumber who had lost his home to foreclosure after his wife's medical bills had wiped him out. He had heard the story of the old couple in the jail from Earl at the hardware store. He showed up one day with his toolbox and a quiet offer. "I can fix that leaky faucet for you," he said, in exchange for a hot meal. Walter stayed too. He took over one of the empty cells, turning it into a small, tidy room. He systematically went through the entire building, perfecting the plumbing Frank had roughed in. He was a quiet, dignified man who, like them, had been discarded by a world that no longer had a use for him. Their found family was growing. The old jail was no longer just a home for 2. It was becoming a sanctuary. Each of the empty cells that Frank and Dorothy had cleared now had a purpose. One was Sarah's room. One was Walter's. Another became a communal pantry, stocked with vegetables from Dorothy's garden and supplies bought in bulk. They established a simple system. Everyone worked. Everyone contributed. Frank was the master builder. Walter was the plumber. Sarah was the painter and gardener. Dorothy was the quartermaster, managing their supplies and finances. It was a small, self-sufficient ecosystem built on mutual respect and shared need. Not charity exactly, more like an exchange. The last 2 cells were designated as guest rooms for anyone else who might show up at their door in need of a temporary haven. They had, without ever intending to, created a refuge. The irony was not lost on Dorothy. They had bought a prison to find freedom, and now they were turning it into a place that offered freedom to others. News of their project spread through the small towns in the county. It became a piece of local folklore. The crazy old couple who bought the jail. Some people scoffed, but others, like Earl, saw something admirable in it. Donations began to appear at the end of their driveway. A bag of used clothing, a box of canned goods, an old but functional generator. The community, the real one, was quietly acknowledging them. Meanwhile, back in their old life, their absence was finally being noticed. Michael and Susan had at first been relieved by their parents' silence. It made their own plans simpler. But as weeks turned into months, their relief curdled into a vague unease, and then into outright suspicion. They drove by the house. It was dark. The lawn was overgrown. A stack of yellowing newspapers sat on the porch. They called the police, feigning panic. A wellness check was performed. The police reported that the house was empty, but there were no signs of foul play. The car was gone. It appeared the Millers had simply left. This was a complication Michael and Susan had not anticipated. Their plans for the house, for the assets, were predicated on their parents being present, either alive or dead. This limbo was inconvenient. They hired a private investigator, a cheap one who mostly handled infidelity cases. It didn't take him long. A few questions at the bank, a chat with the lawyer who had set up the trust, a visit to Earl's hardware store. The trail led directly to the old gravel road and the squat brick building at the end of it. The major threat, when it came, did not arrive in the form of their children. It came on official county letterhead. A building inspector, prompted by an anonymous complaint, a complaint Dorothy was certain had originated with one of her children, had paid a visit while they were in town for supplies. A bright orange condemnation notice was now plastered to their front door. The notice was a long list of code violations: improper zoning, unpermitted electrical and plumbing work, lack of proper egress, failure to meet residential occupancy standards. They were ordered to vacate the premises within 30 days, after which the structure would be demolished at their expense. The piece of paper felt heavier than a tombstone. After all their work, all their progress, they would be swept away by a wave of bureaucracy. The system, the one that had failed to protect them, was now actively trying to crush them. For the first time since they had started their project, Dorothy felt a surge of genuine despair. They had built their fortress, but they had forgotten about the world outside its walls. Frank read the notice, his face grim. He crumpled it in his fist. "They're not taking this," he said, his voice a low growl. "I built this right. It doesn't matter if it's right, Frank," Dorothy said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not to code. We never got permits. We never had inspections. We were hiding." That evening, the atmosphere in the jail was funereal. Sarah was quiet, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Walter stared in his coffee cup, his shoulders slumped. They were all about to be homeless again. The next morning, Dorothy was on the phone. She called the county planning office. She was put on hold. She was transferred. She was told, in a bored, monotone voice, that the condemnation order was final. An appeal was possible, but given the extent of the violations, it was pointless. She was about to give up when she remembered Earl. She called the hardware store. She explained the situation, her voice flat with defeat. Earl listened patiently. When she was done, he was silent for a moment. "Henderson," he finally said. "That's the inspector's name. Mark Henderson. He's a stickler for the rules, but he's a fair man. He used to be a builder himself. What can we do, Earl?" Dorothy asked. "You can pass the inspection," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "You've got 30 days. I'll make some calls." Earl Hobbs was a man of his word. 2 days later, a small army descended on the old jail. It was not an army of soldiers, but of grizzled, semi-retired tradesmen. A retired electrician named Sal, a roofer named Pete, a mason named Luis. They were all friends of Earl's, members of an informal brotherhood of men who knew how to build things. They came not for money, but for the challenge. And perhaps for the quiet satisfaction of helping two of their own stand up to the county. Sal inspected Frank's wiring. "It's good work, Frank," he said, nodding in approval. "Solid. But you need to ground it to code and put it in conduit. Let's get it done." Walter and Pete tackled the plumbing, ensuring every joint was sealed and every pipe was up to modern standards. Luis, the mason, looked at the window frames Frank had cut. "You need proper lintels above these, or Henderson will have a fit," he declared, and immediately set to work. It was a whirlwind of activity. The jail, which had been a quiet sanctuary, was now a bustling construction site. Sarah organized a painting crew. Dorothy became the project manager, keeping everyone supplied with coffee, sandwiches, and meticulously ordered parts from Earl's store. Frank worked alongside the man, his pride swelling as they praised the solid bones of the work he had already done. He was not their charity case. He was their peer. The community rallied in a way that left Dorothy speechless. People who had only heard their story showed up to help. The pastor from a local church brought a crew of volunteers to clear the overgrown land. A local farmer dropped off a truckload of fresh topsoil for Dorothy's garden. It was a silent, powerful statement. They were no longer outsiders. They were part of the town. As the 30-day deadline approached, the confrontation they had been dreading finally occurred. A sleek, expensive sedan pulled up their gravel driveway, looking profoundly out of place. Michael and Susan got out. They were dressed for a business meeting, not a visit to a rural construction site. They stared at the transformed jail, at the people working on the property, their faces a mixture of confusion and disgust. "Mother," Susan called out, her voice sharp and uncertain. Dorothy walked over to them, wiping her hands on her apron. Frank, Sal, and Walter stopped their work and watched from a distance. "What is this?" Michael demanded, gesturing at the building. "What are you doing here? People said you were living in this ruin." "We're not living in a ruin, Michael," Dorothy said, her voice calm and level. "We're living in our home." "This is not a home," Susan shrieked, her composure cracking. "It's a prison. You need to stop this nonsense and come back. The house is waiting. We've been worried sick." "No, you haven't," Frank said, walking over to join his wife. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a saw blade. "You've been worried about the money. We heard you. In the hospital. We heard every word." The accusation hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Michael had the decency to look ashamed, his gaze dropping to the ground. Susan, however, went on the offensive. "We were upset," she cried. "We thought we were losing you. We were just talking through possibilities. You can't hold that against us." "Talking about selling my home before I was even cold in the ground," Frank said, his voice devoid of heat, stating it as a simple fact. "Talking about my wife as a problem to be managed. Talking about our life's possessions as junk to be appraised." "This is insane," Michael muttered, shaking his head. "You're choosing this place, and these people." He gestured vaguely at Walter and Sal. "Over your own family? Over the home you built?" "This is my family now," Frank said, his voice ringing with a conviction that stunned his children into silence. "These are people who help each other, who respect each other. As for the home I built, it was just a house. I can build another one. I did build another 1 inch." Dorothy looked at her children, at their expensive clothes and their pinched, angry faces. She felt a profound and final sense of release. The grief was gone, replaced by a calm, clear-eyed pity. They were strangers. They had been for a long time. She just hadn't allowed herself to see it. "You should go now," she said. It was not a request. It was a dismissal. Michael and Susan stood there for a moment, sputtering, unable to process the finality in their parents' voices. They had come expecting to find two confused, vulnerable old people they could manipulate and control. They had found two strangers, hard and unyielding as the brick walls behind them. They got back in their car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Frank and Dorothy did not watch them go. They turned and walked back to their work. Have you ever been in a position where the people you trusted most were the ones who let you down the hardest? It's a pain that cuts deeper than any other. Frank and Dorothy decided to turn that pain into mortar and brick into something real and lasting. If you've made it this far into their story, you probably understand that feeling of wanting to build something new out of the wreckage. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in their position. And if you're enjoying this journey, please hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. Now, back to the final test. The day of the inspection arrived. It was a bright, clear morning. The work was done. The jail was as ready as it would ever be. The small community gathered in the main hall, their mood a mixture of anxiety and defiant pride. They had poured their hearts and their skills into this place. Now, it was all in the hands of one man. A county vehicle pulled up precisely at 9 o'clock. A man in his late 50s, with a clipboard and a weary but professional demeanor, got out. Mark Henderson. He walked up to the front door, his eyes already scanning, taking in the new roof, the clean windows, the freshly painted trim. Frank and Dorothy met him at the door. "Mr. Henderson," Frank said, extending his hand. "I'm Frank Miller. This is my wife, Dorothy." Henderson shook his hand, his grip firm. "Mr. Miller, let's see what you've got." He started on the outside, checking the foundation, the roof repairs, the electrical meter base Sal had installed. He made notes on his clipboard, his face unreadable. Then he came inside. Sal, Walter, and Pete stood by, ready to answer any technical questions. Henderson walked through the building with a methodical slowness. He checked the breaker panel, his flashlight beam tracing the neat lines of conduit Sal had run. He went into the kitchen, testing the GFCI outlets. He went into the bathroom, flushing the toilet and turning on the shower, checking for leaks and proper drainage. He measured the width of the doorways and the height of the ceilings. He spent a long time in the main hall, looking up at the smoke detectors that were now installed and interconnected. He peered into each of the small rooms, noting their transformation from cells to living quarters. He was silent, professional, his expression giving nothing away. The tension in the room was thick enough to breathe. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, he stood in the middle of the main hall and clicked his pen. He looked at the anxious faces around him. He looked at Frank and Dorothy. "Well, I got the complaint," he began, his voice a low baritone. "I expected to find a derelict death trap, a squat. I was prepared to red tag this building and have you all out of here by noon." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "That is not what I found," he continued, a note of something like wonder in his voice. "I found some of the best damned wiring I've seen in a residential conversion, Sal. Walter, your plumbing is cleaner than what I see in brand new subdivisions. Frank, the structural work here, it's solid. It's overbuilt. It's done right." He looked around the room, at the clean floors and the bright, warm walls. "This isn't a jail anymore," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It's a home, a damn unconventional one, but a home nonetheless." He took the condemnation notice off the door. He took a green tag from his pocket and signed it with a flourish. He placed the past sticker squarely in the middle of the front door. A collective breath was released. Sarah let out a small sob of relief. Walter clapped Frank on the shoulder. Earl, who had shown up to offer moral support, was beaming. "You're all clear," Henderson said, handing the signed-off paperwork to Dorothy. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Officially, the victory was quiet but profound. They celebrated with a potluck supper that evening. The long table in the main hall was laden with food. The room was filled with laughter and conversation. These people, once strangers, were now a family, forged in a crucible of shared work and mutual respect. They had faced down the system and won. They had built a home, and now it was theirs, safe and secure. The story did not end there. A reporter from the local paper, hearing about the strange tale of the jail-turned-sanctuary, came out to do a story. The article was a human interest piece focusing on the resilience of the elderly couple and the community that had sprung up around them. It was titled The Shawshank Redemption of Frank and Dorothy Miller. The article was picked up by a regional news network. Suddenly, their quiet life was a local sensation. More donations arrived. A local nursery gifted them a truckload of fruit trees for an orchard. The church group came back and built a playground for Sarah's baby, who was due any day. The publicity had another, unintended consequence. It was the final public humiliation for Michael and Susan. Their colleagues, their friends, everyone they knew saw the story of the parents they had abandoned. They were not portrayed as concerned children, but as the villains who had inadvertently sparked this incredible story of renewal. Michael, enraged and embarrassed, cut off all contact. He retreated into his world of angry deals and quick profits, a man forever soured by his own greed. Susan, however, had a different reaction. The public shame, combined with the clear, unvarnished truth of the article, finally broke through her layers of entitlement. She sent a letter. It was not filled with excuses or justifications. It was a simple, painful apology. She wrote of her shame, her regret, and her deep, hollow loneliness. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not ask to be let back into their lives. She just wanted them to know that she finally, truly understood what she had lost. Dorothy read the letter several times. She showed it to Frank. He read it and handed it back to her without a word. The next day, Dorothy wrote a short reply. "The door is open." A week later, Susan came to visit. She did not arrive in a fancy car, but in a modest, used one. She did not bring gifts. She brought only herself. She spent the afternoon helping Sarah weed the garden. She had a quiet, awkward dinner with them. It was not a magical reconciliation. The wound was too deep to be healed in a day. But it was a beginning, a slow, tentative rebuilding of a bridge that had been burned. Life at the jail settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy who became the cherished grandchild of the entire community. Walter, with his newfound security, began teaching a free plumbing workshop for young people in the town. The last two cells, the guest rooms, were rarely empty. They housed a rotating cast of characters: a teenager kicked out by his family, a woman fleeing an abusive relationship, a veteran struggling with PTSD. It was a place of transition, a safe harbor where people could rest, heal, and prepare for their next chapter. Frank and Dorothy were the quiet, steady center of it all. They did not see themselves as leaders. They were simply the caretakers. Frank spent his days in his workshop, which he had built in an old outbuilding on the property. He made furniture for the new arrivals, repaired broken tools, and taught the younger residents the basics of carpentry. His hands, once weakened by the stroke, were now strong and sure again. Dorothy managed the ever-expanding garden, the communal finances, and the flow of people. She was the listener, the planner, the quiet heart of their community. She kept a ledger, not of debits and credits, but of people helped, of small victories won, of lives pieced back together. One cool autumn evening, a year after the final inspection, Frank and Dorothy sat on the small porch he had built off the warden's office, which was now their private sitting room. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Below them, the lights of their home glowed warmly. They could hear the faint sound of laughter from the main hall, the cry of Sarah's baby, the murmur of conversation. Frank reached over and took Dorothy's hand. His grip was strong. "You were right," he said quietly, looking out at the world they had built. The foundation was solid. Dorothy leaned her head on his shoulder. She thought of the house he had built for them so long ago, a monument to a life that no longer existed. She thought of this place, this ugly, beautiful, defiant fortress of hope. One was a house. This was a home. In the window of the main hall, she could see a photograph they had framed. It was a picture of the two of them, taken on their wedding day in 1954. Two young people staring out at a future they could not possibly have imagined. A future of love and loss and betrayal, and finally, a hard-won peace. The porch light Frank had installed flickered on, a small, steady beacon in the gathering dark. It was on a timer now. It stayed on all night, every night. A silent promise to any lost soul who might be wandering down that old gravel road. A promise of safety. A promise of sanctuary. A promise that here, in this place, they would find a light left on for them.